So we've been going through the book of 1 Peter, and Alex last week shared about suffering, right? And thank you, Alex, for and your whole family for being vulnerable about it. Thank you for just showing us the good way, the right way to handle suffering, and the wrong ways to handle suffering, right? So with that, this week, I'm going to walk us through the next chapter in 1 Peter. Let me get this going, enter full screen mode. All right. So the next chapter in 1 Peter is chapter 2. Oh, yeah, there you go. My pretty little animated presentation. Peter offers us a way of handling our suffering, right? He offers us a way, and he describes this way of reorienting ourselves to the new paradigm. Right? At the very beginning of the month, John presented this idea of us being exiles, right? Exiles in this world as we carry on about life, right? And Peter puts it, actually, I'll turn it there. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 22, he says, because we have been, verse 22, purified by obeying the truth. And then in verse 23, because we've been born again, not perishable, but imperishable, now we live and walk in this new way. And today my sermon is titled, Walking on Water. You may ask, what does that have to do with 1 Peter chapter 2? It really doesn't. But I think to understand where Peter's coming from, we do have to look back at Peter's life, right? That's how you understand anyone, is to understand where people are coming from, their perspectives, their worldviews. You have to hear their story, right? And you have to know where they came from and what they've experienced in life. And walking on water is one of those experiences for Peter. So I kind of want to go back just quickly. We'll spend most of our time in 1 Peter 2, but I want to go back and look at Peter's life, his younger years. In Matthew 14, I'm not going to read all of it, but I'm going to give you a quick summary and paraphrase. In Matthew 14, this is a story of when Peter walks on water. Jesus walks on water, right? Jesus sends his disciples out on a boat, right? He goes off to pray by himself, and it gets dark, and for whatever reason, Jesus decides, I'm going to walk out on this water to meet these guys out in the boat, right? And in let's go to verse 25. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said, take courage. It's okay. It's just me. Don't be afraid. And then Peter, of course, being the kind of guy that he is, says, okay, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. This word right here, tell me to come to you, that phrase is actually challenge me, command me. So Peter is essentially saying, all right, Jesus, if it's you, dare me to come out. And so in verse 29, Jesus is like, okay, I dare you. Come on out. And Peter does. In fact, Peter literally steps out and walks on the water. Of course, when he saw the wind and the waves, it scares him, and then he starts to sink, and he cries out to Jesus, and Jesus grabs him, right? So this is an experience that Peter had, right? And as far as I understand physics and surface tension, right, it's not possible for us to walk on water. It's not possible. I think the properties of water in Peter's time hold relatively true today, so we can't walk on water, right? To me, the idea and just the concept of that, it's absurd. Let's just be fair. It's absurd. It's like, and I think Peter probably thought the same when they saw Jesus walking on the water. Yet, it happened. It happened, right? The impossible was possible. So today I want to put a twist on this idea of walking on water, right? I want to use it as a metaphor to help us see that Jesus is offering us this way of walking that's pretty much absurd, right? It's absurd. It doesn't make sense, right? It challenges everything we've come to believe and know about life, right? And it defies our common sense and our logic. This is the way that Jesus walks. And he offered this to Peter, right? This is Peter's experience. So Jesus is saying, this is possible. You can walk on water. Now, I'm going to use that metaphor, not about literally walking on water, but about this life we live, right? And Peter, right, uses this. He doesn't use it directly, but I think he pulls from these ideas of like, wow, we can live a life that's so different and absurd. So let's go to 1 Peter chapter 2. And I'll stick to 1 Peter 2 for the rest of the message here. In verse 1, right, of course, Peter, I love Peter because he's very, as you know, straight and to the point. And sometimes in his younger years, he spoke out of line many times. But as we read in 1 Peter, he's grown in maturity. Right? And we see a lot of very practical wisdom. Peter's he's still straight to the point, right? But he offers us a lot of practical wisdom on living. So in chapter 2, verse 1, he says, therefore, right? Anytime you hear therefore, there's obviously some context that comes before that, right? Therefore, again, I read earlier, because we've been purified, verse 22 of chapter 1, and because we've been born again in verse 23, right? So therefore, because of that, because we live in this new paradigm, this new understanding of the world, right? This is what we do. We rid ourselves, it says in verse 1, rid yourselves of all malice and deceit, hypocrisy, envy, slander of every kind. Like newborn babies, crave pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up in your salvation, now that you have tasted that the Lord is good. So I want to pause on this for a second because I think it's easy to read this list, malice, deceit, hypocrisy, envy, slander, and just be like, okay, right? But I think this list is very intentional, right? Peter uses these words very intentionally. So I want to kind of flesh out why he uses these words. Malice, right? Look at malice. Look at your Bible, it says malice. What is that, right? To me, it's ill intentions, right? It's bad intentions, a disposition that you have to hurt others, right? To take matters into your own hands, right? That's kind of the overall encompassing idea of malice, right? And then he goes on to say, okay, deceit. What is that? Let's flesh that out. Deceit is essentially lying, concealing things, right? 1 John, we know from 1 John 1 that John says we must walk in the light, right? So deceit is opposite of that, of walking in the light. We are to be truthful. Peter says, put away deceit, right? And then he goes on to say hypocrisy. Like, okay, why is he talking about these things? Hypocrisy. Well, as I read this and looked over it, to me, hypocrisy is essentially a form of deceit. In fact, I think hypocrisy is the highest form of deceit. It's like once your deceit gets to the highest, level, hypocrisy is the fruit of that. Because you not only are deceiving others, you're really deceiving yourself when you live hypocritically, right? You're deceiving yourself. Like most lies are circumstantial. They're kind of situational. You'll tell a lie here or there. But hypocrisy is like a living, breathing, walking lie, right? So this is why Peter mentions this here, right? So he's very intentional about using deceit and hypocrisy. And then he goes on and he says, envy, right? He mentions envy. Envy is what you feel towards others. It's a feeling you have towards others, and it's usually not a good feeling. It's not a warm, fuzzy feeling that you have towards others. Envy is essentially a lack of contentment, right? A lack of contentment that you have that's directed at others, right? When you direct your lack of contentment towards others. And really, it's rooted in a lack of trust of God. And you just are insecure. And what comes from that, again, just like hypocrisy comes from a heart of deceit, slander is the fruit of envy. Slander is when you lack this security and trust in God, and it kind of seeps out of your very being, and the things you say, it just comes out of you when you live with a heart of envy. So Paul mentions these because, and he says to throw it all away, right? Because at the end of the day, we're created for relationships. We are created for relationships. When you read through all of Peter's letter here, letter, you'll find that he mentions 3 relationships throughout. He references the relationship you have to the world, right? He starts that off at the very beginning of Peter. And then he mentions our relationship we have to God, right? How we are God's chosen people. And then he goes on to mention that in relation to the people of God, right? So those are very key to Peter's understanding of how we operate in this world. So if you live a life in private that's different than what you live in public, right? In this metaphor, you're sinking, right? You're sinking, you're not walking on water. If at home or at work you engage in activities that you would never engage in around, right, this family of believers, then you might consider yourself to be sinking, right? And I've seen many people live that double life, and it's hard to see when someone you just see like, wow, they're drowning, and the thing with hypocrisy is it's kind of like, again, bad breath. You can't smell it, but everyone can see it, right? It's really hard to tell that you're being hypocritical, but people around you can. People around you can tell. So, and this is challenging because, right, you have to look at yourself and say, hey, am I sinking? Am I drowning, right? Slander, just like talking in your mind even, public, privately, or in your mind, when you start to cut people down, when you look down on others, when you talk negatively, then I would say you're failing to walk on water, right? These things are very subtle, right? These things that Peter lists off here, they start off very subtle. We have to be very careful. That's why he says, got to throw that off. Got to throw that away, right? We were created for relationships, right? Everything we do is in context to that, right? So either you live as one who walks on the water, or you sink. And then I'm just going to read through the rest of 2 Peter here. His next part, starting in verse 4, Peter goes through and says, he gives us his own metaphor about stones. As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For in Scripture it says, see, I lay a stone in Zion, a precious and cornerstone. The one who trusts in him will never be put to shame. Now to you who believe, this stone is precious, But to those who do not believe, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and the stone that causes people to stumble, and the rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the message, which is also what they were destined for. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of the darkness and into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are a people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. So Peter goes on to give us this metaphor of stones, and I think maybe he has some sort of affinity to stones, considering his name. And so he's like, well, I'll talk about rocks, right? So Peter goes on to share about these, and he even goes on to say, hey, in verse 5, you are like living stones. You are just like me, Peter, right? Y'all are like me, like we're living stones, right? And I think Peter, again, probably recalls every experience that he's had with Jesus, and he's like, Jesus is giving us this opportunity to walk on water. And Peter wants to give us that he's kind of trying to give us that heart of like, Jesus is offering us this ability, right? And this challenge. So that's what I love about this chapter. Peter really hits on what we are and what we could be, right? And what we should be is like him, a living stone. And then he goes on, right? So again, I'm going to just go through all of 2 Peter and kind of tie it back to walking on water. 1 Peter chapter 2 here. All right, so verse 11. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits. Again, it's all about relationships, right? So there's a relationship we have to the world. And Peter says, you should live such good lives, right, among the pagans. You should be people who are different. Like your lives should be profoundly different. In fact, it should be, in some ways, awkward and weird to the world. It should be weird to the world. Walking on water, right? When Jesus walked on water and came to his disciples and to Peter, what was their reaction? Fear. They were terrified. They were like, it's a ghost, right? It's a ghost. It's so out of place, right? Living a life that walks on water, right? It's going to confuse people, as Peter says here, right? They're going to accuse you of doing wrong. They're going to be like, something's wrong with you. You're a freak, right? They're going to accuse you. They're going to want to, again, in Peter's metaphor about the stone, right? In verse 8 there, he says, it's a stone that causes people to stumble, right? It's gonna trip people up. It's going to trip people up. This kind of life that we walk, it should trip people up. It should make them be like, whoa, what's going on? Am I seeing a ghost, right? That kind of reaction. And this is why I think walking on water really informs Peter's perspective on the world, and it should inform ours, right? And then Peter goes on to give some very, very practical advice on how we live, and very specific advice, right, in the rest of chapter 2 here. And he does it all throughout the rest of his letter, right? But I'm only going to stick to chapter 2 here. We'll just read it. Verse 13, all right? This section is all about submitting to authorities. Submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. He goes on. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to them as to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. All right. For this is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. Wow. This is an example of walking on water. Any of this, if you were just to separate yourself from all your thoughts and be like, does this make any sense at all? All right, let me propose this to you. Does it make sense to submit to a cruel and unjust dictator, right, who, specifically in Peter's time here, his name is Nero, Emperor Nero, and he is going around killing everyone in your family who is a Christian, all your friends who are Christians, burning them and putting them up on stakes publicly to be displayed? Does that make sense to submit to him? Does it make sense? It's absurd. You're walking. To do this, you have to walk on water. You have to walk on water to live this kind of life, right? This is hard. That's hard a hard pill for me to swallow, in terms of our context in America and all our political leanings. It's hard. It's hard to swallow, right? It's a hard pill to swallow. It's hard to live it out. And then Peter goes on, right, in verse 18 there, and he calls us to submit to cruel and harsh masters, right? Here's the reality. Some of you, including me, we can't even deal with our bosses and coworkers. It's hard for us to submit to even those guys. Imagine being beaten, right? I'm going to surmise that most of us have not been beaten by our managers or bosses at work, right? But most of us can't imagine that. That thought of being beaten, it's a foreign thought to us, right? It's as foreign as walking on water. It doesn't make sense. But Peter calls us, right, to walk on water, right? To do the impossible, right? The only point I want to really make here, the main point is that, I want to point this out. Verse 17 and 18, there's a word there that's used in both passages, and the word is fear. Fear of God, right? If you have no fear of God, you won't be able to walk on water. That's the reality. It's where you start. You start with a healthy fear of God. To see God's power at work, it kind of honestly has to scare you. It has to scare you. It has to provoke you, like it did Peter, right? When Jesus came out on the water, it stirred something. It made them, one, scared, fearful, but also it provoked them. And it provoked Peter to be like, I don't know, dare me to come out on the water. And Jesus was like, okay, come on out, right? It has to. If it doesn't scare you, if the fear of God a healthy fear of God is not in you, it's going to be very hard to live out this life that Peter is describing, right? Like submitting to authorities, right? If you want to dare to walk on water, you have to have that healthy fear. I don't know, when I see people grumbling on social media or in person, or I feel like when I see someone who lacks respect for their parents or teachers or I don't know, pastors or police officers. I mean, even I would say, dare to say, our political leaders, even though those guys make it very hard for us to respect them at times. Like, if you lack respect for these leaders, these people in your life, like, maybe you need to re-examine your fear of God and your trust in God, right? That's just where I stand on it. It's hard for you to submit, right, to authority, then I think that's a reflection of your fear for God. So I'll leave it at that. And so, yeah, let's continue reading, right? Because the only way that we can overcome this is to follow in Jesus' footsteps, right? And Jesus gave us an example, right? In verse 21, I'll continue reading. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps, right? So he gave us an example. He showed us how to walk on water. Verse 22, he committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds we have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. To walk on water, we have to be a people that when people insult us, when people do injustice to us, we do not retaliate, right? We follow the example. The example is when we suffer, we don't make threats, right? That's hard. You need to go back and chew on that one, right? Instead, we have to entrust ourselves to him who judges justly. And that's how we walk on water. And Christians across the past millennia, many have done just that, right? Even, I have a little letter here. I didn't want to put the whole letter on the screen because the font would be really small. Scan that QR code. And I'm going to read the letter to you. Well, part of it. I'm going to read part of the letter to you. This is an apologetic letter. We don't really know a lot of history behind who wrote this letter, where it was written, but scholars were saying about 130 AD to in the late 100s. This is about 60 to 100 years after Peter wrote his letter in 1 Peter, right? These are the Christians that live during that time. And I just want to share this because I feel like it's a powerful story of how we should live as Christians, right? And so I'm just going to read it. You can look it up later if that QR code doesn't work. It's called Letter to Diognetus. All right. For the Christians are distinguished from other men neither by country, nor language, nor customs, which they observe. For they neither inhabit cities of their own, nor employ a particular form of speech, nor lead a life which is marked out by singularity. The course of conduct which they follow has not been devised by any speculation. They don't proclaim themselves advocates of some human doctrines. They inhabit Greek as well as barbarian cities according as each of them, the lot of each of them has been determined, and following the customs of the natives in respect to clothing, food, right, and the rest of the ordinary conduct. Basically, the first part of this is Christians in the 100 ADs, you couldn't distinguish them from the regular population, at least as far as their customs, the clothes they wear, the cars they drive, or whatever, the chariots they drive, right? You couldn't distinguish them. What you could do, though, is look at their life, right? He goes on to say in this letter, they dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners. As citizens, they share in all things with others, and yet endure all things as foreigners. Every foreign land to them is as a native country, and every land of their birth as a land of strangers. Right? They marry, as all others do. They beget children, but they don't destroy their offspring. They have a common table, but not a common bed. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws, and at the same time, they surpass the laws by their lives. They love all men and are persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death and restored to life. They are poor, yet make many rich. They are in lack of all things, yet abound in all. They are dishonored, yet in their very dishonor are glorified. They are spoken evil of, and yet are justified. They are reviled and blessed. They are insulted and repay insult with honor. They do good, yet are punished as evildoers. When punished, they rejoice, as if quickened into life. They are assailed by Jews as foreigners and are persecuted by Greeks. Yet those who hate them are unable to assign any reason for their hatred. We have to live this kind of life, right? To walk on water means to live this life that doesn't make sense, that we submit to authorities who are unjust, right? To people who beat us. That's where we start, right? As people who walk on water. That's the example that Peter wants us to follow. Peter wants us to follow an example of people who walk on water, who live very absurd, like doesn't make sense kind of life, right? So, like Peter, I encourage you guys to walk on water, to live a life that reflects walking on water, and whatever that means to you. But to me, it means like it doesn't make sense, right? And it's gonna challenge people, scare people. It'll scare you. You'll be terrified, and you'll have a healthy fear of God, right? And everything you do in your life will reflect that. So my encouragement to you is go out, walk on water, and allow the spirit of Jesus to just infiltrate every way you live your life. So.